All right. Thank you, everyone. Hope you had a nice lunch. So we will be starting again this afternoon. And next up, we have Lei and Nguyên Hoang, who will be talking about security in machine learning.
Thank you, Aurélien. So, hello, everybody. So, I'm very happy to be here, and I'm very thankful for the invitation. And I also kind of want to apologize because I feel like I'm going to have a slightly different tone, as I'm going to be kind of the annoying IT guy telling everything that's going wrong with machine learning. But hopefully I'll also be exciting you about potential solutions to make machine learning more secure. So just to present myself very quickly, I'm co-founding a startup called Calicarpa. I was a researcher at TPFL before that. And I'm also president and co-founder of Tonsor, which we will be talking about in a bit. And as well, I'm a science communicator on the YouTube channel Science for All. So I'm just going to start with a very quick crash course in adversarial machine learning. So basically, the idea of adversarial machine learning is to study what happens when machine learning is under attack, because typically it is deployed in an environment where there are different people who are different participants who may be malicious entities and may want to bias, harm, or hijack the machine learning system. So essentially, if you go to Wikipedia at least, there are three families of attacks on machine learning. One of them is what I will call a privacy attack. So the problem of privacy attack is that you build a model, but then this model is out there, and people can look into this model and try to retrieve information, typically about the training data of the model. So this is not what I'm going to focus a lot about today. And I'm going to give examples for each of these in a bit to make it very clear in your head. The other kind of attack that has been studied quite a lot, actually, is known as evasion attacks. So essentially, the idea of evasion attacks is to exploit the imperfection of a trained model. So the most concerning application of this is when machine learning is used for things like fraud detection or anomaly detection. Or content moderation, for instance, where the model is already deployed and it's used by many people who want to bypass the machine learning system, and they will try to identify some vulnerabilities, some weak points in the machine learning algorithm, and then exploit it to, for instance, make their content classified as non-spam, for instance. Again, I will give an example of this in a bit. And the third kind of attack, which I will be developing a lot more in this talk, is the idea of poisoning attacks. This is, to me, the most concerning kind of attack. It's essentially the idea of trying to bias the model during training, to make sure that the model, once it's trained, it already behaves poorly. And so you are different kind of subvariants of this. You can try to harm the system, like make it bad, typically if it's the ML system of a competitor, but you also may want to bias it or even backdoor it, and I'll be giving examples of this as well. I'm going to add an additional kind of attack here, which is not listed on Wikipedia, but which I think should be considered for responsible development of machine learning, is the case of misuse. Once we put a model out there, then we should expect anyone to be able to reuse this machine learning algorithm, and sometimes they can be reusing this for very bad purposes. So just to give more examples, in terms of privacy attacks, one of the most concerning applications of privacy attacks on machine learning is arguably the case of language data. In particular, if you have to think today that like these language models are already deployed massively on very large scale. So for instance, this is here on the Google keyboards. So the smart keyboards are learning from what you type to make better predictions. So I don't know if you knew about this when you said OK when you created an account on Google, but Google gives themselves the right to use this data in all sorts of algorithm design. In fact, it's even been published in a paper on Archive, where they explicitly say that they used like the Gboard of like the English-speaking population of Gboard users in the United States, so that's hundreds of millions of people, to train their algorithm. I want to insist on the fact that these are learning algorithms, so literally these are algorithms that are designed to learn from the data that they are exposed to. So there's a huge risk here that they learn from this kind of data. And this is particularly concerning in the case of keyboards, because this is arguably the most sensitive kind of data out there, at least one of the most sensitive kind of data. Typically, a lot of people today use Signal or things like this to write very sensitive information in a encrypted manner. But before the message is encrypted and sent, well, it is typed on a keyboard that literally learns from this data. So this arguably should be taken extremely seriously, but as of now, like, very little attention has been given to this problem. And the algorithms are very opaque, so it's very hard to find out. Another thing I want to insist on is that even if you trust everyone in your company, many people in your company, you should be worried that, especially if big company, there may still be a few employees that are actually malicious or spies from other countries. And it's been revealed here, so this is an extract from the United States Department of Justice, where two former Twitter employees and the Saudi national were charged for acting as illegal agents of Saudi Arabia. So even if you think that your company is being responsible, you have to ask yourself, are there employees within your company who may be behaving maliciously and try to extract data from your systems? And so the best way to protect against this is arguably to make sure that ahead of any training, you make sure that the system is not going to learn sensitive information. Again, this is not the topic of these talks. I'm not going to dwell too much on this, but this is a huge problem that urgently needs to be more fixed. Now, the second kind of attack that I was mentioning is the case of evasion attacks. And it's used, like as I said, in many applications. And one thing I want to insist on is the fact that the algorithms are going to be under attack. And this means that like the adversaries, are going to change their behavior once the algorithm is deployed. So for instance, there has been claimed that some algorithms for toxic content detection were correct at 99%, for instance. It's important to realize that this is actually far from sufficient. For one thing, it still means that 1% of toxic information is still published. And if there are billions of harmful content, of toxic content out there, 1% of a billion is still like tens of millions. But what's even worse than this is that the attackers, those that produce here like hate speech or stuff like this, they will adapt to what the algorithm is doing. So if they keep seeing that when they speak in a certain manner, it gets censored, like it gets moderated, then they will change their behavior. And they can change their behavior while still producing hate speech. In particular, if they are able to find this 1% that's published, even though it's hate speech, then you may expect them to only produce this kind of content. And then the algorithm that's 99% correct then can be like 50% correct or essentially useless eventually. So it's really important to think of these kind of evasion attacks, especially given that there's a lot of research that shows that like many models can be usually have these kind of vulnerabilities, especially if the model parameters are published. Again, I'm not going to dwell too much on this, so this is just to mention that this exists. The fourth kind of attacks that I mentioned was misuse. Here I'm going to just take the case of one application of deepfakes, of generation algorithms of text or images. These are used these are clearly reused. And they are misused sometimes for very bad purposes. So on the left is a harassment campaign against a journalist in India that was critical of the government. And the campaign includes deepfakes, pornography that was produced and published on the internet. And it was clearly horrible for the journalist. Another thing that we may be more and more concerned with is the idea that as these tools get more and more out there, it's going to be easier and easier for everyone to produce very bad content and to have this shared massively. And so arguably there's a real concern that these kind of things may be used, for instance, by kids, for instance, in schools against other kids in school. Again, I'm not going to dwell too much on this, but I think this is something that really should be given a lot of attention. We should take care of potential misuses of the technologies that we produce. Now, I'm going to zoom a little bit into the poisoning attack. So again, poisoning is the idea of biasing the machine learning models during training. And there are multiple ways to do this. So one of the ways is, the most common way is through data poisoning. So typically you produce fabricated data such that the algorithm that learns from this data will have a bad behavior, will be biased or harmful or will have a backdoor. Another kind of attack that happens in a distributed setting, so machine learning is more and more distributed on multiple machines. There's this idea of a federated learning where the computations is actually done mostly on our phones, like on users' devices. Once you have this distributed setting, you have to ask yourself, are the components of this setting reliable? And if they are not, well, how can we protect against them? What if they crash, for instance? What if they get out of battery and don't respond anymore? Or worse yet, what if they are in the possession of bad actors? Can they completely bias the system? So this is part of a field sometimes called Byzantine machine learning. So Byzantine, like it's in distributed computing, it means a bad guy, because like we wanted to name the bad guys, and well, no one identifies themselves as Byzantine, so let's go with Byzantine. And finally, a third kind of poisoning attacks that I will discuss very briefly in this talk, but I will give plenty of examples of each of these, is what I will call like single point of failure attacks. It's simply like the one entity who is doing the machine learning system, what they can bias the algorithm. And what's concerning is that there are recent findings that show that they can do this undetectably, which gives them a lot of power. I will go back to examples and to the math of this in a bit. So let me just illustrate how ubiquitous all of this is. So you might have heard that recently, so Kylian Mbappé, for those who don't know, he's a football player. Kylian Mbappé was recently found, according to Mediapart, to have been targeted by a digital army of hate trolls that was actually bought and created by an agency that was actually having a contract by his employer. Sorry. Oh, that's a poisoning attack on my talk, sorry. So the Paris Saint-Germain actually had a contract with an agency to do a smear campaign on its player.
On its own player?
Sorry?
On its own player?
On its own player, yeah. So why would they do this? Like, there are plenty of reasons why you could want to do this. Like, one of them is you negotiating contract and you're making him feel bad or something like this. There's a lot of power struggle between these people. So, like, he's very well paid, so like negotiating the contract. So there's a lot at stake here. The other example I'm taking is the one from the left, from the right for you. So it's a report from the Institut de Recherche Stratégique de l'École Militaire in France, so a military study group in France, about Chinese influence operations. And so in the report, one of the figures that they reported is the number of Chinese people that seem to be paid to produce this information. So what do you think this number is? How many Chinese people are paid to produce this information for the Chinese government? What would you say?
How many Chinese people
Are paid
money?
with money to produce this information? So the estimate they give here is 20 million. 20 million and 2 million in full time. So 20 million, like most are in part time. Yeah, so that's the amount of like fabricated content out there on the internet. Like, actually, Facebook reportedly reports to remove around 6 billion fake accounts every year. 6 billion fake accounts. That's
Nearly as many as there are real humans.
yeah. Well, more than human Facebook users, right? So that's how much data poisoning there is out there. And many algorithms are learning from conversations on social medias. Literally, like there's a paper from Google about Palm, like the language model, that reports that 50% of the training data set that they use is conversation on social media. Like 30% is downloaded from the web, and like 4% is like Wikipedia, and you have other sources. But there's a lot of data poisoning out there.
So Facebook have to do it, otherwise they will be saying, oh, we have 20 billion users.
Exactly.
Wait a minute.
So Facebook claims to have 3 billion users, human users. Yeah, I don't know. Like, how do you verify this? It's a tough question. One thing I would like to stress is that like models are learning from this, and so they will learn from a lot of the activities that are done online, including what's produced by these information campaigns. And you know that in many countries, so here I took the example of India in particular, there's like anti-Muslim propaganda is almost a governmental thing. Like it's there are political parties that are really driven by this kind of speech. And so they would pay like fake news factories, also known as troll farms, to produce a lot of this kind of content. And the issue is that many machine learning models today are learning from this kind of content. And it should be unsurprising that they themselves end up producing this kind of content. If you learn from hateful content, then you end up producing hateful content. Like literally, it's trained to learn the statistical regularities and how frequent this or that is in the training data set. So if most of it is anti-Muslim, then you should expect a lot of anti-Muslim content. And so this is an experiment done by Abu Bakr Abid. Whenever he triggered, he prompted GPT-3 with mentions of Muslims, it consistently talked about terrorism and murder and stuff like this. So how bad can it get? I'm going to argue it's already happening like very, very dangerously. So on the left is like arguably today's worst genocide, ongoing genocide. It's happening in Ethiopia against the Tigray community. Like reportedly, there have been over 500,000 people killed. 500,000 people killed. In comparison, for instance, the invasion of Ukraine, the estimations vary a lot, but it's between 10,000 and 100,000. So in Tigray, the situation is a lot worse, and there's famine as well. So the thing is very bad. And a lot of this is driven by a lot of hate speech produced and shared massively online. This happens also in France. So this is last week actually. Last week in Lyon, but apparently mostly in Lyon, you had a protest in the street where people were shouting, "Death to the migrants." This is like a very dangerous hate speech, and arguably like this is just rising everywhere in most democracies throughout the world. And of course, you surely heard of the Capitol riots in the US, where a lot of disinformation and hate has prompted some very terrifying event 2 years ago, or a bit less than 2 years ago. And this comes a lot from, in particular, the role I would argue of recommendation algorithms. Well, first of all, let me discuss this report. So VDEM is a group of geopolitical researchers in geopolitics. Every year they write a report, so it's kind of like the IPCC of geopolitics. And over the last few years, they've been more and more concerned about the future. And the last report is arguably extremely alarming. If you read it, it's literally very scary. In terms of toxic polarization in many countries, the rise of authoritarian regimes throughout the world, arguably there's a real source of concern here. Now you might want to ask, yeah, maybe the algorithms, this is a talk about AI, what does AI have to do with this? Like, is really AI to blame in this? So we argue the main way through which algorithms are amplifying these risks is through recommendation algorithms. And to really measure the power of recommendation algorithms, if you haven't read them, I really recommend the Facebook Files, in particular interviews with Frances Haugen, where they really show a change in the algorithm, really changed what was massively shared by recommendation algorithms, and also what was produced by the content creators whose revenues often depend on how many views they make and which depend on what the recommendation algorithm recommends. So arguably there's a lot of reasons to believe that there's at least something very dangerous going on with recommendation algorithms. In fact, in the case of Russia, so this is an extract from some post that wrote Lev Gershenson, sorry for the pronunciation. So he's the former Yandex news head. And 6 days after the beginning of the invasion of Ukraine, he wrote, I'm reading, today is the 6th day that on the main page of Yandex, at least 30 million Russian users are seeing that there is no war. Every day and hour of such news cost human lives. It's not too late to stop being accomplices of a terrible crime. If you can't do anything, quit. So these are really strong words, especially accomplices of a terrible crime. But it really shows the importance of the algorithm that selects what to show to hundreds of millions 30 million Russian users. Another thing I want to insist on with this slide is the fact that this is not an individual problem. I think too often when we think about recommendation algorithm, we think about the relation between the algorithm and the user. But here, what we see is that what's recommended to 30 million Russians is endangering the lives of 40 million Ukrainians. The victims may not be the ones who are exposed or who are using the content recommendation algorithm. And you can make the same case, for instance, in the case of climate change. If the recommendations push people towards polluting behaviors, then it's affecting people who did not use the recommendation algorithm. If YouTube suddenly makes extremely popular, very polluting habits, like traveling around the world with planes and all sorts of very polluting behaviors, then it may affect the safety of people in Madagascar, for instance. So that's why I think it's really important to reflect on what they are doing. And another thing that this slide shows is that, in a sense, there's also this big concern of a single point of failure. Here we have Yandex that's really centralized, and that's under Russian laws. And this constrains them into the kind of algorithm that they can develop and deploy. Arguably, you see all sorts of issues here. Like this is a famous, unfortunately famous, French researcher who has been pushing a lot of disinformation, and that's now who's now being sued. But he was made famous a lot by the recommendation algorithms. This content made millions of views, 1.3 million of views, and he produces content every week. I make myself a video, so it's very frustrating for me to try to make very rigorous videos with a lot of sources and make it high quality, and to see that next to my own video, this content is widely more recommended. And I'm insisting on another thing, is that the number of views that the video makes is really dependent on the number of times it's recommended by the recommendation algorithm. Essentially, the click-through rate does not vary that much. What really makes a difference is how much the content is recommended. And still another concern is that for most of these algorithms, their governance is actually extremely dictatorial, very centralized and dictatorial. And we really think the case that, with the case of Twitter, that it can flip very suddenly. So even if you trust your current leaders, then it may change very quickly, especially with the case of Twitter here and Elon Musk. And maybe it will completely change, and so you can completely hack the recommendation algorithm just by having someone purchasing the recommendation algorithm today, which is very scary. Something that's also very concerning to me, even more actually, is the case of TikTok. So TikTok, we know what happens to CEOs in, so there's the case of Jack Ma, the CEO of Alibaba in China, who disappeared for a few months because he was criticizing the Chinese government too much. So you have to imagine that TikTok is under the same kind of influence. And the fact that TikTok is growing more and more popular, especially among teens throughout the world. It's more used than YouTube today among teens in the US than YouTube. This really is a concern. In a sense, TikTok is an excellent spyware for one thing. It draws a lot of data and people install it, so it's many people are installing a Chinese spyware on their phone. But in addition to this, you have to think of this, and I think this even more, as a remote control. In a sense, now with TikTok, because especially TikTok, the videos goes one after the other, so the recommendation algorithm is really critical. Having more and more people using TikTok is giving more and more a remote control for the Chinese government to decide what content to show next to hundreds, to now billions of people on Earth. This should be extremely concerning, especially given that the Chinese government is known for doing all sorts of manipulations of information, like hiding things, concealing information, and producing disinformation itself. Okay, so that was the first part of my talk. So if I did my job well, it was not as exciting as the previous talk. Sorry about that. Now I'm going to insist on the fact that if you want to secure these systems, we really need mathematicians to get involved. We really need to think mathematically about many of these issues. And this may sound very counterintuitive, given that there's a lot of politics at stake as well. In particular, the question that we're trying to answer in security in machine learning is, can we design systems for which we can guarantee that adversaries will not be able to cause harm or to bias the model so that it recommends more content rather than others, or to backdoor the model such that it, like a backdoor in the model typically is like you modify the algorithm in such a way that you know how to modify your own input such that suddenly, for instance, it gets recommended widely. You make a tiny, imperceptible modification to your input, and then it does some behavior that you planted in the algorithm. Okay, so how do we go about security? So the kind of security theorems we would like is the following. So we want to construct algorithms that are safe, and ideally what you would want to prove is that for all instances, so like for all kind of data typically provided by honest users, for any kind of attacks by the adversaries, you want to make sure that when the algorithm runs on the instance and the attack, it provides some safe enough output. That's kind of like the kind of security theorems that we are seeking. Of course, there's a lot of things that you can manipulate. Like maybe you only consider polynomial term algorithms, or maybe you restrict the kind of instances that are realistic. Maybe you consider a probability distribution of instances rather than a for all. there are lots of variants, but that's kind of the idea. And I'm insisting on the importance of having mathematical theorems here because of the quantifiers for all. It's impossible to do simulations and explore like very large spaces. So like mathematical theorems here are extremely useful to have security confidence. But the flip side of this is that what if we take the negation of this? The negation of this tells us then impossibility security theorems. And so impossibility security theorems would be of the form for any algorithm that anyone can come up with and maybe claim to be secure or whatever. Actually, there exists an instance and there exists an attack for which the system behaves poorly. And actually, I'm going to present more impossible security theorems. I'm going to present both kinds of theorems in this talk. So in the case of learning, typically, so this is like the case even more of data poisoning. What we would like to prove is that there exists an algorithm, a learning algorithm, a safe learning algorithm, such that no matter what the owner's data are, and no matter what the adversary's data are, then when you learn from both, then you obtain a result that's safe enough in a sense. Of course, this has yet to be formalized. And on the other hand, if you take the negation, then you have the impossibility security theorem for data poisoning. Now, usually this kind of thing is very hard to study like this because well, like machine learning is complicated already itself. You cannot study all kinds of learning machines because there's so many different machine learning models out there. So we've tried to simplify this and to reduce this as much as possible towards a problem that we can more easily study. So we have a few successes in this regard. So for one thing, we managed to prove that the problem of data poisoning, which is very hard to study data, is actually equivalent to another problem, which is the problem of Byzantine attacks, like in a distributed learning setting. Like what if some people behave, like send arbitrary data, for instance, or have arbitrary behaviors. Like we managed to prove an equivalence between these two, and this is very helpful because, well, Byzantine attacks are actually much easier to understand because they have more structure, a nicer structure. And then we have another theorem that was a Nueb's paper that says that the problem of collaborative learning, so like resilience to Byzantine attacks, to understand this problem in its general form is actually equivalent to a much simpler problem, which is the problem of, which I'm calling here C-secure averaging. So C-secure averaging is what? Is like, let's say everyone here has a number in mind, and all I want to do is to compute the average of all of our numbers, except that among us there's a few malicious people, a few spies, and I want to only learn the average among the people who are not spies, like the honest people. Of course, I cannot do this in general, so I'm going to make an error, but I want this error to be provably bounded. So intuitively, what happens is that if our numbers are very similar, like if most of us are thinking about the numbers 2, then it's going to be quite easy to recover something close to 2 because like this is going to be the dominant, and if you go with the majority, assuming there's only a minority of malicious people, then you would be fine. But if everyone has a very different numbers to start with, then it's going to be harder to have a good estimation of the true average. Yes?
Can I ask what kind of math is going into this?
What kind of math? So essentially, this to prove this, so there's one direction. So you do reduction, so it's reduction techniques. So assume you have a solution to do a secure averaging. Essentially, you build up a learning algorithm based on this. Essentially, by replacing whenever you see an average in classical learning, you replace this by the oracle that does C averaging. And then you run the usual proof of convergence of machine learning, and you just tweak it so that it works. And then the proof on the other side is essentially showing that secure averaging is a kind of machine learning problem.
So is it like sequences convergence or?
yeah, but it's not asymptotic. Like the proofs are not asymptotic. Yeah. Yeah, like it's a lot of machine learning techniques with like gradients, bounding, and stuff like this, finding worst cases and stuff like this. So yeah, maybe I'll go a little bit into this equivalence between machine learning and averaging, and collaborative learning and averaging. So the idea is you consider that each honest user has a local loss, and you assume that each honest user wants to minimize the sum of the losses of the honest users only. But now they are attacked by Byzantines, who are like indistinguishable from honest users. And let's denote learn of. So the algorithm will depend on the losses of the honest users and the behavior of the Byzantines, which can be a bit weird and arbitrary. I'm not going through all the formalization here because it's a bit long, but that's kind of the idea. And then our equivalence says that if you have an algorithm that solves the former, then you can solve the latter, which is like a good estimation of the average. And if you have an algorithm for the latter, you can use it to construct a solution to the former. Yeah, it's just to give you a bit of idea of what's going on, but I'm not going too much into the details. So a corollary, important corollary of this is that the condition on top here, if the heterogeneity, you have a term on the right that appears, which is the heterogeneity of the losses of the honest users. So there's also this idea of heterogeneity, is how similar or dissimilar the honest users are in the kind of data typically that they generate. So if you see that the heterogeneity, so if the heterogeneity is equal to 0, then you actually have a guarantee, well, it's, like you have to work a little bit to have it more clearly, but essentially you have the guarantee that you can get the gradient of the loss to go to 0, which is like the classical convergence result. So essentially, in the case of homogeneity, you can actually fully secure your algorithm. You have a full security in the case of homogeneity. So this is really nice for applications where you expect homogeneity. So typically if you apply machine learning to physics, like you expect the systems to, like my system here to expect it to behave the same way as a system of somebody else in another country, and so on. So you have a full security. So there's, I'm not sure why I put this, but there's the idea of synchronous or asynchronous communication, but I'm not going to go too much into the details, as I'm guessing you're not into distributed computing. In fact, you can even make the reduction efficient from a computational perspective. Like the previous theorem was only security, like there was no computational complexity concept, but you can have some computational efficiency. But what I want to insist on here is more of the problem of heterogeneity, which is arguably the much more realistic case. Why? Because typically if I do a language learning, then the way I type on my phone is very different from the way any one of you type on your phone. And even more different than the way like different people on the street. So for instance, for one thing, sometimes I text about math, and some other people will never text about math. Because of this heterogeneity, which also occurs in recommendation algorithm, the way I consume YouTube is very different from the way anyone else consumes YouTube. You then have, we can then prove impossibility results. More precisely, what we do to prove impossibility results is that we prove that there are some lower bounds on what can be achieved in the case of averaging, because we show that averaging is equivalent to learning. And then we transpose this result to learning. So typically, one theorem that we proved is that you cannot do better than this, that no algorithm can guarantee that you will do better than this. So no algorithm can have the safety guarantee that the estimation of the average will be at an error that's f divided by 2h. So f is the number of malicious people and h is the number of honest people, times the diameter of the honest people's vectors. And because of this, we have immediately the consequence that you have a similar impossibility theorem for the robustness of learning algorithm.
If there's no honest people, then it's okay because the right-hand side is unjust.
Sorry?
If there's no honest people, then it's okay.
Yeah. So, yeah, if
In general, no.
if the Chinese government stops spending money on this information, it will be okay. Maybe not, but yeah. So another thing to remark is that the heterogeneity will typically grow as square root of d. One way to think about this is that if you take a normal distribution, so let's assume like we're all variation from like there's a like every user has there's like a true user, let's say, and everyone is a normal distribution variation from the true user. Then the distance between different people will be about square root of d. So the norm of a random variable that's normally distributed in dimension d is of norm proportional to square root of d. One way to think about this is that if I look at the difference between people along only one criterion, so let's say gender, for instance, then the variance will not be huge. But then if I look at gender than age, then it creates a bit more variations. And the more I look at ways to differentiate people, the more the distance between different people grows. And so if it grows typically as square root of d, then the worst case harm that an algorithm can guarantee will grow as f times square root of d divided by h. The important part here is the square root of d, which shows that essentially the error grows as you have bigger and bigger models. Larger and larger models are more vulnerable. There's more space to attack, essentially. And this creates, because they create more heterogeneity, so it's easier for the attackers to look similar from everybody else while biasing the models towards their preferred location. And so that's a really concerning finding, given the current context where people are pushing for larger and larger models. The issue with larger models here is that they are actually more vulnerable as well to data poisoning and all sorts of attacks. Let me say a few words about single point of failures with this. So this is a paper, a recent paper. One of the authors is Shafi Goldwasser, who is a Turing Award winner. And this paper, like this is a very spectacular finding actually, which raises serious concerns of trust. It's the ability to plant undetectable backdoors in a machine learning algorithm if you are the entity doing the training of the algorithm. So the technique has to do with cryptography, and so the idea is you do the training and then you modify a bit the machine learning model such that then you sort of plant a key in the model, and then you take any input, and on any input you can put the other part of the key, and it will be classified as you want it to be classified. So this is a very powerful attack. Like typically you could imagine like let's say TikTok is using this attack. They could say, well, we're making our model public. They're publishing their model. The model is public, but it has an undetectable backdoor, which means that like anyone who knows the backdoor can then upload any content, put a key inside it, and then the algorithm will say this content has to be massively shared. So typically, if it's like disinformation, you put this key in the disinformation, it goes through the recommendation algorithm, and the recommendation algorithm then spreads it massively. And this would be an open source model. This is a very surprising result. Like there are different details about like, but I'm not going to go too much into the details. Yeah, and by undetectable, I meant to say this is undetectable in a cryptographic sense, meaning that the cryptographic assumptions you typically need like a super polynomial number of queries to the algorithm to determine whether it has a backdoor or not. So a possible defense against this is to remove any single point of failure. I meant to say as well, this kind of single point of failure happens as well for any kind of company that does not have the resources to do the computation itself and that outsources this computation to Amazon Web Services or Google Cloud or things like this, then Amazon Web Services and so on could be planting this undetectable backdoor. So one defense against this would be to have a completely decentralized learning where everybody is kind of redoing a little bit the computations, but we don't have to redo all of the computations. It would still be quite efficient to do this with our algorithms. But when you're doing this, again, you have to imagine that in the system there may be some participants that are malicious, and you still need to protect your system against potential malicious people. Like we have algorithms for this, but for the sake of time, I'm not going to go into this. Yeah, actually, our paper discusses this a lot. So it's called collaborative learning in the jungle. This is as opposed to what I sometimes called machine learning in the circus. I don't mean to be too offending, but I think we build a lot of our machine learning models in a closed, secure environments, but it's very dangerous to then put them out there in the wild on the internet where it's going to be the jungle. And another thing I want to point out is that actually our math is still flawed, because the assumption we make is that the majority is right and we should learn what the majority is saying. Except that on some topics, this may be wrong. In some topics, in some locations, this may be actually deeply wrong. Yeah, we need more protection against this. And I get a little bit into this in a bit. So now I want to discuss 4 other takeaways of our research, of our analysis over the years of trying to understand how to secure systems. So the first thing is that if you want better security, it's really important to trace and sign the data, to know where the data comes from, because then if all of the weird data comes from a malicious source, then you can cut all of the data from this malicious source, typically. This is, I think, an important habit, and it's a habit that we scientists propagate a lot, because whenever we write papers, we cite, we trace the origins of our results. And arguably, we need to do the same for any kind of information system, including those that are used for machine learning. The second thing I want to stress is that I think many machine learning papers, most by far, work with an underlying ground truth hypothesis. Like the goal often of machine learning is stated as recovering some ground truth that the data is a variation of. Except that if you really think about the most impactful applications of machine learning today, those that are more lucrative, that are the reason why this kind of event happens, that is funding this kind of events, well, it has more to do with languages, recommendations, or things like ad targeting. And for these applications, it's really unclear what a ground truth is. For instance, if I say the talk I'm giving is, and I ask you to complete, is there a ground truth to this? Like, maybe you would disagree. Like I would say it's fantastic, but maybe some of you would say it's scary. And more generally, like there's not an idea there's an IID distribution of language out there. Like we might say that each individual has a more specific distribution of their data. That would be a better claim. But even this is not like a static distribution, and it's unclear if it should even be described as a distribution. But more importantly, like we don't agree. Like we don't have the same data distribution of content consumption, of language processing, and so on. And this means that there's no such thing as a ground truth. And so what I propose is that instead, the way we should think about what we should learn eventually, and you could even think of this outside of the realm of machine learning, what people should learn is not what's most out there, but rather it should be more like something like close to the scientific and moral consensus when it exists. And when it doesn't exist, at least maybe search for compromises, or at least have an understanding of the kind of disagreements there are out there. And this prompts us, like this kind of thinking, prompts us to thinking about learning rather as a vote. So actually my PhD was in voting theory, so I have a strong bias in this regard. But the more I think about this, the more I really think about machine learning as a voting system. even for things like language models. Because in a sense, in a language model, whenever I'm saying something, when I'm producing data that is going to be used by a learning algorithm, it's as though I am voting for the algorithm to repeat what I'm saying. Now, the bad thing with language models today is that they are not really designed with the idea that they are a voting system. And as a result, they have very bad voting properties. For one thing, those that speak more, that produce more data that is learned by the algorithm, have literally more voices to influence the algorithm. And this is creating all sorts of issues. Like for one thing, it's like encouraging everyone to talk a lot. And for another thing is if you want to have a farm troll, then you actually control what the algorithm is saying, especially if you target it on the specific content. And so the principle that we are pushing more and more in our papers is rather the idea of one person, one unit force, which would be in a sense of a fairness principle, like everyone has a unit force. It's also a nice security principle in the sense that nobody has too much force and can influence the algorithm too much. So typically what I mean by that is that when you're doing gradient descent, so in machine learning, typically we consider only gradients that are unit norm or something like this, such that everyone is pushing, and so you compute gradient for each, with respect, for each person you have a gradient that corresponds to the gradient with respect to their data. And then everyone only has this unit vector, and then there's a notion of fairness in the sense that everyone can pull in with the same force. Arguably, this is also a way to be more inclusive, more fair, as opposed to approaches that tries to remove outliers. Because especially if you see learning as a voting algorithm, removing outliers kind of sounds like silencing minority views, which can be also of a problem. Okay, so very quickly, because I'm running out of time, I'm going to discuss very quickly like our effort to try to build an actually secure system, recommendation algorithm. And this is an effort called Tournesol, so it's on a website called tournesol.app, so it's available, so tournesol.app. And what we're trying to do is how to have a secure system, and by secure, what we demand is decentralized in the sense that different people will be influencing the algorithm, but the way also that the preferences of everyone is going to be aggregated is secure. In particular, no individual should have a dictatorial power on anything on the system. So this is deployed, this is supported by an association called the Tournesol Association, which I am co-founder of, and we don't have a lot of money, and we are very happy, would be very happy to have any kind of partnerships and support. So what's going on Tournesol? So on Tournesol, anyone can create an account. We have security filters to, essentially you need an email address associated to a domain for which we don't believe there will be a lot of fake accounts, like for instance at ihp.fr, I don't know if it exists, but like if you have an academic domain, typically this will be accepted. And you also have a vouching mechanism where people can vouch for another and a way to assign to be more inclusive while guaranteeing security. And then anyone can then connect on the website and compare two videos. So the idea is that we ask the contributor to put themselves in the shoes of a recommendation algorithm, because our goal in the end is to make recommendations, right? And the issue is that the amount of content you can recommend is very finite to a given user. So you always have dilemmas, you always have to make choices. And so the question we ask people is, take two videos on YouTube. You can import them from YouTube. You can take videos that you already watch, typically. And we ask our contributors to tell us which of these two videos should be more largely recommended. And then based on people's inputs, we have our safe algorithms, which I will present in a bit, that aggregates people's opinions and then makes actual recommendations. And if you use our browser extension for Firefox and Google Chrome, then you would have the recommendations right on the front page of on the home page of YouTube. Yeah, so one big challenge in terms of security that I want to insist on is the idea of sparsity. And sparsity creates a lot of issues in terms of security. What I mean by sparsity is that most of the content out there on YouTube have never been rated by anyone. It's like we miss data. Like we don't have data about what people think of these videos. And even those that have been scored on Tonosol, they haven't been scored by many people. And this is a big issue because these are alternatives that nobody scored are extremely vulnerable. If you use, even if you use like median-based solutions, so the median is often regarded as secure, but if you use the median of all of the scores, if only one person rated the video, then the median is the score itself, right? So this means that there's an easy attack if you use the median. For an attacker, they can take the most horrible kind of video on YouTube, bring it onto Tonosol, and say that it's amazing. And this would be widely recommended by our algorithm. So you need to protect against sparsity. So the basic idea to protect against sparsity is to say that by default the scores should be equal to 0, and then we can move away from 0 only if there are sufficiently many people who voted, who said that the score of the video should be large. And so we formalize this notion. So the idea is that the influence of a voter with a given voting right cannot be more than 1 divided by W. Another way of saying this is that the behavior of the algorithm when you assign a certain voting right W should be about the same as the behavior of the algorithm when you assign W prime as voting rights. And by about the same, I mean that the difference should not be more than the difference between W and W prime divided by big W. And we then design an algorithm that satisfies this property, which we call the quadratically regularized median. Well, it's very simple. We add a quadratic regularization to this term on the right, which if you only minimize the term on the right, you would get the median. Yeah, for the sake of time, I'm not going to dwell too much on the details, but based on this, we have a Byzantine resilient primitive. Then we have another problem, which I want to talk about because I'm in France right now, so I call it the French reviewer problem. The problem lies in the fact that the sparsity is biased, meaning that it's not as though a content is randomly, like the set of people who score the content is a random subset of all contributors. Like some content will attract some kind of reviewers. And this is a problem if this content is attracting French reviewers only. Why? Because French people always complain. And so they will always be unsatisfied with this kind of content. It will have a bad score, not because the content is bad, but because it's only rated by French people. Of course, I'm using a caricature here. I'm French myself, so I'm allowed to. Now, the other caricature I'm going to use, which I'm not less allowed to, is the Marseillais reviewer problem. So, for those who don't know, like Marseille is a city in the south of France, and Marseillais people are known to always exaggerate. Like, as soon as they see something bad, they say, "Oh, this is crap," and as soon as they see something good, they say, "Oh, this is amazing." Now, the issue with this is that if a content is only scored by Marseillais people and it's good, then it's going to be scored as amazing. And since Tonosol mostly recommend amazing videos, hopefully, then Tonosol will be mostly recommended what's scored by Marseillais people, which is arguably an issue. So we need to protect against this. Now this has to do with the von Neumann utility functions. I'm not going to go into the details, but essentially we did what we do in voting theory. So in voting theory, like we don't have a way to test the results of a voting algorithm, because there's no ground truth. So instead, what we do in voting theory is we list desirable properties for our voting algorithm, and we're trying to prove that the algorithm satisfies these properties. So this is another way where mathematics is critical to this kind of design. So we have this notion of sparse unanimity. I'm not going to go too much into the details, but essentially it means that you can recover a unanimous preference. And we showed that our algorithm satisfies both this sparse unanimity property and has this security guarantee of W Byzantine resilience. One last thing I want to say is that about this is that we're very open, like it's a non-profit association. We are very the code is open source, the license is AGPL, very free, and we also have a public database which is ODCBY, which is very open, reusable for commercial use and so on. And we really encourage people to use this kind of data set. This is arguably us asking our contributors to label data and to provide quality labels on very complex data, namely YouTube videos. So based on this, you can then consider that a video content that was well scored on TunerSold is the kind of things that should be replicated by typically a language model. So you can use typically the caption of the videos and train language models. And we hope that as we build more and more data, we score more and more videos and so on, we will produce more and more a database about what people believe should be said by language models typically. So that's really our hope, and we welcome any kind of help or even use of our database without our knowledge with this. So let me give now the conclusion. The conclusion I want to stress on is like we really need to check our working hypotheses. Like some of them, many of them have are either unrealistic or have undesirable consequences. In particular, the IID assumption is the most widespread assumption in machine learning, arguably, and it's really questionable. If you think about this, especially for language models, what does it really mean to have IID data? It's really unclear. Arguably, it's really unrealistic. Another thing I want to stress is that something very common in machine learning papers is to say that we are going to minimize the data fitting loss without questioning this assumption. But if you really think about this, this is a big assumption because it's saying that our model should behave like the data that we collected. It's like generalizing the past data. And if the past data is biased, if it's hateful, it's full of disinformation, then we will have algorithms that generalize this kind of content. And in a sense, when you're writing this, you're taking a political stand by saying that we should reproduce the past or the status quo. So I think we should really question these kind of assumptions, which is evidently not easy, but I think this is an effort we should do. A third remark is that you see a lot of papers that claim robustness based on empirical finding. So maybe it's a bit harsh to say that it's unscientific, but again, when you see the formulation of adversarial machine learning, you need to test against all sorts of attacks. And if you cannot have a good enough reason to believe that your simulations capture all kinds of attacks or all kinds of worst case attacks, then unless you have this, and usually people don't have this, then it's very clumsy or even misleading to claim robustness. And it can be very dangerous in large-scale applications. Another thing I would like to say, so this is a quote from Sophie Zhang, who's a former Facebook employee, who worked a lot on moderation and stuff like this. And one of the things she said is that Facebook, like she talked about complicity by inaction, by effectively turning a blind eye. And I think this is a real danger that we are all potential victims of, is like not wanting to see all of this, even though I would argue like we already see like major social and political consequences of all of these algorithms already in all democracies and in all dictatorships throughout the world. One last thing I want to say. I want to discuss another vulnerability which is not exactly within machine learning, but it's more with the habits of machine learning. And it's the fact that, so this is a screenshot from the torch.load page. So if you're using PyTorch, you're probably using torch.load at some point. And it's written very clearly as a warning that you should never load data that could have come from an untrusted source in an unsafe mode. It says only load the data you trust. this is not the common behavior of most data scientists that I know. Like most data scientists just do torch.load with models downloaded from the internet. And this is extremely dangerous because you have arbitrary code execution. Meaning that if on your laptop or on the machine you're using to run torch.load, there are sensitive data, like typically a client data, then you could have a malware run in torch.load that extracts all of this data. So torch.load is actually very, very dangerous, and it should be run with a lot of caution, at least so far. So one thing that we are working now, so I'm now starting a startup trying to protect against this kind of attack. And our idea, so we are called Calicarpa, and our idea is to do Python module sandboxing, meaning trying to reduce the rate of the models that or the things you import in your Python code, so that they cannot do this kind of data extraction, they cannot parallelize your system, and so on. So evidently, like the application is a bit beyond like torch.load. It's really about protecting Python systems in general. In fact, in Python, I don't know if you knew about this, but whenever you do import whatever, you're running the code of this whatever. And if there's a malware in this whatever, like you have arbitrary code execution. So essentially, you're trying to design a system that protects against this. And finally, I want to read this sentence in this. So it's a survey of practices of machine learning in the industry. I'm just going to read it. Industry practitioners are not equipped. So it's based on the interview. Industry practitioners are not equipped with tactical and strategic tools to protect, detect, and respond to attacks on their machine learning systems. I think there's a lack of investments and of expertise right now in securing machine learning systems. I think it's high time that we invest much more in this kind of security protections. And with this, I thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Lei, for a great talk. We're going to take some questions from the audience.
Hi, thank you for the talk. I've got a question about Tournesol, where you try to gather good data only. Wouldn't it be easier to use all the data, but ask users to tell you what is bad?
Yeah, it's a good question. So I think it reflects that we have a lot when it comes to social media to see everything that's bad and say we should remove it. I would argue it's the wrong way, because there's a lot of bad things. So it takes too much time to look through all of the bad things. So we argue in Tournesol that it's a much more effective approach to try to instead recommend top quality content.
There's lots of content to recommend.
Yeah, there's a lot of content to recommend, and that's interesting for one thing, and we would like to know what are the top quality content to recommend. The other thing is that you also find, actually, empirically, we also found that the top quality content have very diverse scores. So even within content that are correct, for instance, that are fun to watch, that are well explained, there's still a lot of variation about how much people think this should be more recommended than this. And it's even more the case if you consider the fact that we live in an attention economy where attention is very limited, and there's a lot of humanitarian causes that want more attention. So, like for instance, I know people from Ethiopia who are dying to have more attention. Like all of the attention about war is going to Ukraine, and so they are dying to have more attention. But the same thing goes for Lebanon, for Sri Lanka. Like there are many countries that need attention. And so it's very hard to know how to arbitrate this, and in a sense that's what we're trying to do through Tournesol.
Hello. I was wondering if you can explain something more about the recommendation system that is going once like I vote something. I mean, you showed that you were recommending some content on the YouTube page. How is like the ranking system done?
Yeah, so like we run the algorithm, well, it's a bit more complicated than what I explained, unfortunately. I always wish my algorithms were simpler, but the idea is like, so the idea of the quadratically regularized median is like, it's like we put ourselves in, so I actually explain like this, like we put ourselves in a parabolic valley, and then everyone positions themselves where they think the score of the video should be. Okay, it's a line 0. And then everyone is going to pull on the score with their voting right, with a force equal to their voting right. And so this protects against malicious people because if there's only one malicious person and they have a finite voting right, like at some point, like the slope of the parabolic valley is going to prevent them from pulling too far. But if there are enough people, you can try to think, well, it's going to compute more and more like the median, a point where like half of the people are pulling in one direction and the other half is pulling on the other direction. I don't know if I answered your question.
Yeah, but like, so basically there is like no personalization.
No. Right now there's no personalization through these recommendations, but one thing I didn't say is that we also ask contributors, if they want, it's optional, to compare the videos along different criteria. So typically we ask them what content is more reliable, what content is more pedagogical, what content is talking of a more important topic, and so on. And on the TourNeSol website, you can customize how much importance you give to the different criteria.
And just last question: Are you scared about like polarization?
Yeah.
It may happen that, for example, on some COVID-related things, like the majority is actually behaving as the bad actor.
Yeah.
So would it be actually have like a very worse effect on everyone else?
Yeah, it's a very good question as well. So this is a big concern. And TourNeSol is still like kind of majority-based, so it would be vulnerable to a majority of misinformed people. So our idea to fix this is to value expertise, like scientific expertise. So there are multiple ways we can go about this that have not been deployed yet. One way is to have every person declare their own expertise and to have other people vouching for their expertise. And then assigning voting rights based on this. There's a lot of questions that are not clear, like how do you use these voting rights, how do you compute it? The other option is like having recommendations made by specific entities or like members of a specific entity. So one thing I would love, for instance, is to have people from the IPCC, le GIEC, to use TourNeSol, and then you would have the recommendations by the people, by the members of the IPCC. Same with like World Health Organizations and so on.
I have a question regarding the privacy perspective of the machine learning algorithms. Like we know now that there are lots of users that have subscribed to different YouTube channels. I was wondering if someone wants to unsubscribe, let me say, and we know with respect to the RGBT law, we must, the machine learning algorithms that have been previously learned on this kind of training data can be removed. Like this subscriber has removed his account and he wants the machine learning algorithm to stop being trained on his data. Can the machine learning algorithm unlearn in this case?
Yeah, so I'm not an expert in unlearning. I like to learn. But I know that there's research people trying to do machine unlearning. It's not easy. Also, I know that, but yeah, I'm not an expert, so I will not be able to answer.
Hi, thank you for the interesting talk. I just have a question regarding the bounds that you showed. Do you know if they are tight?
The bounds, well, it depends on the bounds.
I think they were in slide 22 and 23. Yeah, these.
So these are not tight, but just because I was a bit lazy to do the rigorous computation, and also because it's a bit harder to write like the actual theorem. Like you have to have put a strict inequality plus epsilon. It was a bit harder, but it's not hard to have the tight result based on our proof.
Okay, so you think they could be tighter, right?
Yeah.
Okay,
You
thank you.
can make tight easily.
Thank you.
If there are no more questions, let's thank the speaker again.